It is unknown just when Obadiah prophesied. It could have been right after the fall of Jerusalem in 587 to 586 BC. His prophecies were against Edom, who was the descendants of Esau. The Edomites, who were relatives to the Israelites, sided with Jerusalem's enemies several times. When Jerusalem was taken by the Babylonians, the Edomites looted Jerusalem and handed over the refugees to the Babylonians. Then they went in and possessed part of the Negev, which is the southern part of Judah. The Edomites were proud people who believed that they could escape the judgments of God because they lived in the high and inaccessible cliffs of their land. These may be the cliffs that Israel will escape to in Revelation 12:6, where the woman will flee into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared of God for 1,260 days. God said, "For your violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever." He said, "You shouldn't have rejoiced over the destruction of Judah in the day of their affliction and calamity. As you have done, it will be done unto you. Your reward shall return upon your own head." Obadiah's message concerning Israel was that they would repossess their land and rule over it. The last verse of Obadiah, verse 21, says, "And saviors shall come up on Mount Zion to judge the mount of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's." Dake's Bible commentary on this verse says the saviors will be the Messiah and the resurrected saints and the angels who will make up the armies of heaven at the Battle of Armageddon and who will deliver Israel. After Obadiah, there were no prophets for 14 years. Then Haggai and Zechariah prophesied in the second year of King Darius. Haggai spoke to Zerubbabel, who was governor of Judah at the time, and said, "Thus says the Lord, the people say it is not time to rebuild the Lord's house. You have your houses, but this house of the Lord lies waste. Consider your ways. Go get wood and build the house, and I will take pleasure in it, and I will be glorified. Because my house lies waste, but you have your houses to go to. Therefore the heaven over you is stayed from dew, and the earth is stayed from her fruit, and I called for a drought upon the land." Then the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of people, and they came and did work in the house of the Lord their God. The new temple that they had rebuilt was not as glorious as the first temple, but the Lord spoke of a temple that would be built in the future, and he said, "The glory of this latter house shall be greater than the former, and this place will I give peace, saith the Lord of hosts." The temple God spoke of here would be the temple that would be built by the Messiah during his millennial reign. Another prophet, Zechariah, prophesied in 520 to 518 BC and urged the people to rebuild the temple, as did Haggai. He also was a priest as well as a prophet, which is fitting since his book largely concerns the temple and priesthood. Haggai's focus had been on rebuilding the temple, but Zechariah's focus was on the people's spiritual transformation. Zechariah exhorted the high priest and the remnant to faithful obedience in order to receive God's blessings. If they did as the people had done in the past and failed to be obedient, God would again allow their enemies to scatter Israel. Zechariah's night visions in chapters 1 through 6 are God's judgments of the nations, his election and future blessing of Jerusalem, the purification of the land, the rebuilding of the temple, and the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua. The first three visions of the horses in the myrtle trees in verses 7 through 17 of chapter 1, the horses and the craftsmen, verses 18 through 21 of chapter 1, and the measuring line in chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, assure the people of the Lord's coming judgment against the nations who have scattered Israel, of his renewed love for and promise to bless Jerusalem, and of their success in rebuilding the temple. Other visions include the high priest Joshua appearing before the angel of the Lord, who is the Lord himself, the lampstand and the olive trees, the flying scroll, a woman in a basket, and the vision of the chariots, all of which describe divine judgment and also the divine rest that will come. The prophecies of Zechariah predict the immediate gathering of Israel from Babylon, but ultimately the future restoration of all Israel and Jerusalem under the Messiah. Then again, there were no prophets for 29 years before the last prophet Malachi prophesied. At this point in the history of the Jews, we have to keep in mind that they are in two different places. There are those who are captive in Babylon and those who still remain in Judah. Also, we have to keep in mind that most of the 10 tribes of what was the northern kingdom have been scattered. They were taken into Assyria, which had become a pretty big empire. At this point, they are lost, which is why we hear the term the lost tribes of Israel. Some Bible teachers say they aren't lost, but for all practical purposes, they are lost. They are dispersed. They are not together as a nation, and they eventually lost their identity. Many Jews today don't know what tribe they came from. In these present days, God is gathering them back to the land of Israel. Many of them do know what tribes they are from, and this regathering is the end point of their dispersion from more than 2,000 years ago. While the Jews in Babylonian captivity are there for 70 years, they are not slaves as they were in Egypt before Moses brought them out. The Jews in Babylon were to live pretty normal lives in many respects. Jeremiah 24:5 says, "Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, like these good figs, so will I acknowledge them that are carried away captive of Judah, whom I sent out of this place into the land of the Chaldeans for their good, for I will set my eyes upon them for good." During the time of Nebuchadnezzar's reign in Babylon, and after he had brought the Jews in, he became so proud of his accomplishments that after one of his dreams, which he had Daniel interpret, he became as an animal and lived outside with them, eating grass and growing nails like claws. He was like this for 7 years, at which time God restored him to his right mind, and he praised and acknowledged the God of heaven. And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up my eyes unto heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that lives forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. About 30 years after this, when Nebuchadnezzar died, his son Evil-Merodach reigned for 2 years. Then Neriglissar reigned for 4 years. Then Nabonidus for 17 years. He hadn't stayed in Babylon to rule, but moved to Tema in the Syro-Arabian desert for 10 years, leaving his son Belshazzar of Daniel 5:1 as regent in Babylon. When Nabonidus did return to Babylon, he found that his capital city had been overcome by the Medes and Persians. Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Persian had captured Babylon. Belshazzar was having a huge banquet and decided to use the sacred vessels which had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem. He and his guests were drinking wine from these sacred vessels when a hand began to write on the wall. No one was able to read the writing, but someone remembered that Daniel, years earlier, had been able to interpret mysterious dreams. So Daniel was summoned to interpret the handwriting on the wall. His interpretation was, Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom, and it is finished. Tekel, you are weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar had Daniel clothed in scarlet and had a gold necklace put on him. And he made a proclamation that Daniel was to be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Belshazzar was slain that night, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom.